Chapter 1. Born into California. He was born in the fog on October 10, 1967, in San Francisco, California. Gavin Christopher Newsom came into the world in a city as layered and contradictory as the man he would become. The future governor of the most populous state in the Union began life not in the halls of power or on the red carpets of Hollywood, but as the son of a struggling single mother, rooted in a web of privilege and hardship that would define much of his life. His father, William Newsom, was a judge, a man of intellect and influence who had deep connections to some of California's most powerful families. But Gavin did not grow up under his father's roof. After his parents divorced when he was just a toddler, his mother Tessa took on the task of raising him and his sister alone, working multiple jobs to make ends meet. She was a devout Catholic, and she instilled in Gavin not just the routines of Sunday Mass, but a quiet resilience, one that would later serve him when he found himself both in the spotlight and under siege. But Gavin Newsom's story is not simply one of a hard-working single mom and her son beating the odds. His life was deeply entangled from the beginning with some of the most powerful dynasties in California. The Getty family, yes, that Getty family, wasn't just an acquaintance. They were mentors, benefactors, and close family friends. Gavin's father had managed the Getty family trust, and young Gavin grew up with a kind of proximity to wealth and influence that most never experience. Gordon Getty, son of the oil tycoon J. Paul Getty, was particularly close to the Newsoms and would become a key financial backer in Gavin's future business ventures. The Newsoms weren't part of the elite in the conventional sense, but they were close enough to be pulled into its orbit. The connections ran deeper. Gavin's aunt, Barbara Newsom, had once been married to Ron Pelosi, brother-in-law of Nancy Pelosi, the future Speaker of the House. While Gavin and Nancy Pelosi were not particularly close personally, the family tie offered yet another thread in the intricate tapestry of California's democratic power structure. Politics wasn't a distant idea. It was in the air, the blood, and the dinner table conversations. And yet, despite the high-powered connections, Gavin's early life was not gilded. He remembers moving around often, living in small apartments, and even struggling with food insecurity at times. His mother did her best, but there were moments when the fridge was empty and the bills were unpaid. For a boy surrounded by whispers of power and privilege, Gavin was experiencing something very different. Scraping by, surviving. At school, things were no easier. Gavin struggled with reading from an early age. Teachers called it a learning difficulty. Later, it would be diagnosed as severe dyslexia, a condition that would shape his entire approach to life. Reading aloud in class became a nightmare. Homework took him twice as long as his peers. Words danced on the page, and while some teachers were sympathetic, others were dismissive. He was often embarrassed, even ashamed. But that same embarrassment sparked something else, an iron will to compensate. If he couldn't win in the classroom with traditional tools, he would find another way. And so, Gavin Newsom became a master of communication, verbally fluent, emotionally aware, and visually sharp. He learned to memorize. He learned to read people. He learned to lead. Catholicism ran deep in his early years. Not just the rituals, but the moral framework. Compassion for the poor, a sense of justice, a belief in redemption. These were not abstract values. They were lived experiences. He attended Notre Dame de Victoire, a French Catholic school in the heart of San Francisco. There, he wore a uniform, learned to say "we," and tried to fit into a world where he always felt half in, half out. His classmates were often more affluent, more academically gifted. But Gavin compensated with charisma, tenacity, and hustle. He didn't always win, but he didn't give up. He moved on to Redwood High School in Marin County, a public school with a mix of students from wealthy enclaves and middle-class neighborhoods. Here, Gavin found refuge in sports, baseball, basketball, anything that allowed him to compete physically rather than academically. Athletics became his release valve and his confidence booster. It also taught him discipline, strategy, and leadership, traits that would serve him later in both business and politics. After high school, he enrolled at Santa Clara University, a Jesuit institution in Silicon Valley. The tuition wasn't cheap, but thanks to a mix of loans, jobs, and family assistance, he made it work. Santa Clara was another world, more open, more progressive, and more intellectually stimulating. It was here that Gavin first began to see how his unique background could become an asset rather than a liability. He leaned into his strengths: networking, public speaking, presentation. He found mentors, joined clubs, and immersed himself in political science. He wasn't a standout student on paper, but in person, Gavin made an impression. His professors noted his intensity and charm. His classmates saw a future businessman, or perhaps even something more. While still in college, Gavin and a friend launched a newsletter called the Santa Clara Soapbox, a kind of early experiment in media and commentary. But it was after graduation that his entrepreneurial spirit truly ignited. With financial backing from Gordon Getty and others in that inner circle, he launched the Plump Jack wine shop in San Francisco. It wasn't just a liquor store. It was sleek, upscale, and ambitious. Gavin styled it like a boutique, modeled in part after the kinds of high-end retail experiences he'd observed abroad. The wine shop succeeded. Then came Plump Jack Winery in Napa Valley. Then restaurants, hotels, resorts. Gavin Newsom was becoming a brand. The dyslexic kid who struggled in class had turned into a polished businessman with a growing portfolio. He was young, handsome, and media-friendly. San Francisco's social scene embraced him. He hosted fundraisers, gave speeches, shook hands, and built relationships. Not just for business, but for something bigger. Because underneath the suits and the wine tastings, Gavin Newsom hadn't forgotten where he came from. He hadn't forgotten the eviction notices, the empty fridge, or the teachers who doubted him. The success hadn't erased the hunger, it had sharpened it. By his early 30s, he had the looks, the money, and the network. What he didn't have, yet, was power. But that was about to change. Because Gavin Newsom wasn't just a businessman. He wasn't just the kid with connections or the boy with a reading disorder who beat the odds. He was something else entirely. A man who had grown up in the shadows of California's elite. And now, he was ready to step into the light. And that light would come from City Hall. Chapter 2. From Wine to Politics. In the early 1990s, Gavin Newsom stood at a crossroad that few in their 20s ever reach. Armed with ambition, a polished smile, and the backing of one of the wealthiest families in America. With a degree from Santa Clara University freshly in hand, he returned to San Francisco not with the aim of joining a law firm or corporate boardroom, but to build something of his own. He wanted to be his own man. That was important. Even as doors opened for him thanks to his family's ties, Newsom wanted to walk through them on his own terms. That opportunity came in a bottle of wine. Plump Jack was more than a clever name. It was the beginning of a brand and a statement of identity. named after a bawdy Shakespearean character, and a 1980s opera written by then San Francisco Mayor Gavin's father had helped promote. Plump Jack Wine Shop opened in 1992 in the city's Fillmore district. Gavin Newsom co-founded it with investor Billy Getty, son of Gordon Getty, and the funding came largely from the Getty family fortune. In truth, Gavin didn't hide where the money came from. However, he acknowledged it. But he was determined to make the venture succeed on merit. The wine shop was sleek, modern, and upscale, more boutique than bodega. Gavin took a risk. No security glass, minimalist shelves, and handwritten wine notes to guide customers through vintages and tasting notes. It was retail theater, a fusion of class and approachability. For the Napa elite, it felt familiar. For the neighborhood, it felt fresh. And it worked. Soon, Plump Jack wasn't just a wine shop. It became a winery, and then a label, and then a series of restaurants, hotels, and lifestyle brands. From Cow Hollow to Squaw Valley, Gavin's name was quietly attached to a growing portfolio. He wasn't the sole owner, but he was the face. He shook hands, remembered names, and learned what it meant to manage staff, budgets, and setbacks. The young man with dyslexia who once struggled to read menus was now printing his own. But success wasn't just financial. Newsom understood something essential about the era. The 1990s were the rise of branding, personal and professional. Silicon Valley was redefining success as not just wealth, but image. Gavin leaned in. He dressed like a Kennedy, spoke in the careful cadence of someone who had studied every great political speaker from Reagan to Clinton, and moved through San Francisco's elite circles with practiced ease. His charm wasn't accidental. It was strategy. Where others used family money to vanish into luxury, Gavin used it to build visibility. As his business empire grew, so did his reputation. He served on nonprofit boards, joined civic groups, attended fundraisers. And while Gavin wasn't overtly political at first, he was always around politics. It was in the background of every dinner party and charity gala. The city's leaders, Willie Brown, Nancy Pelosi, Dianne Feinstein, were family friends, mentors, and occasional critics. Gavin listened, learned, and waited. Then came the phone call that would change everything. In 1997, Mayor Willie Brown was looking to fill a vacancy on the San Francisco Board of Supervisors. He needed someone young, energetic, media-savvy, and capable of navigating the city's complex politics with both charm and loyalty. Gavin Newsom was the perfect candidate. He had the name, the polish, the business credentials, and, just as importantly, the support of the city's power brokers. For Newsom, the decision to accept wasn't instant. Public life was messy. Every decision was scrutinized, every word measured. But the allure was irresistible. This wasn't just about business anymore. It was about vision. The same drive that pushed him to outwork his classmates now pushed him to step into the public arena. On a chilly January day in 1997, Gavin Newsom raised his right hand and took the oath of office as a member of the San Francisco Board of Supervisors. He was 29 years old. Almost overnight, the entrepreneur became a policymaker. At first, some dismissed him as a political appointee riding family money and glossy charm. But Gavin didn't flinch. He rolled up his sleeves, met with constituents, dug into housing reports, zoning codes, and budget sheets. He wasn't always fluent in the language of government, but he learned fast. And more importantly, he stayed relentlessly on message. His platform? Clean streets, fiscal discipline, pro-business policies. It wasn't flashy, and it wasn't always popular with progressives, but it earned him credibility. He pushed for care not cash programs that offered housing and services instead of direct welfare payments to homeless individuals. A controversial move, but one that signaled seriousness. Newsom had found his rhythm. City politics weren't about ideology, they were about results. Potholes, crime, permits. He talked to residents like a neighbor, not a bureaucrat. He visited neighborhoods few elected officials bothered with. He listened more than he spoke. And when he did speak, he spoke clearly. Gavin wasn't trying to win everyone over. He was trying to prove he belonged. In time, he did. In 1998, just a year after his appointment, he ran for his seat and won. Then again in 2000. The critics began to quiet. He wasn't just a Getty-backed businessman anymore. He was a rising star. But this was only the beginning. Gavin Newsom wasn't content with a seat on the Board of Supervisors. His gaze was already lifting toward the next office. Because for someone like Gavin, restless, strategic, and deeply aware of narrative, politics wasn't just service. It was legacy. And he was just getting started. Chapter 3. The San Francisco Experiment. By the early 2000s, Gavin Newsom had become a familiar face in San Francisco politics. No longer just the young businessman appointed to the Board of Supervisors, he had built a reputation as a centrist reformer, polished, data-driven, and unapologetically ambitious. But San Francisco is no ordinary city, and it doesn't reward moderation easily. It is a place where politics are passionate, personal, and often radical. To survive there as a politician is one thing. To thrive is another. And Gavin Newsom wasn't looking to survive. At the core of his early political mission was a single issue: homelessness. San Francisco's homeless crisis wasn't new, but it had reached a boiling point. Tents in doorways, human waste on sidewalks, and rising frustration from both activists and business owners had created a tense standoff. Newsom's approach, launched under the banner of his Care Not Cash initiative, was simple in theory but polarizing in practice. Reduce direct cash payments to homeless individuals and instead offer housing, treatment, and services. Critics called it cruel, paternalistic, and an attack on the poor. Supporters called it pragmatic, compassionate, and long overdue. Voters approved the measure in 2002, and Newsom saw it as validation, not just of the policy, but of his leadership style. Bold, focused, and willing to take heat. It was an early sign that he was ready to take risks. He applied the same philosophy to other issues. He streamlined small business permitting processes, argued for balancing the city budget without slashing services, and pushed for public-private partnerships to tackle infrastructure challenges. Where some of his colleagues leaned hard into ideology, Newsom leaned into operations. He wasn't interested in political theater. He wanted results, metrics, deliverables. At least, that's how he presented it. The business community warmed to him. So did moderates across the city. And while the progressive wing of the Board of Supervisors often clashed with him, they couldn't deny that he was becoming one of the most visible and effective politicians in the city. By 2003, the mayor's race was approaching, and the field was crowded. But Gavin Newsom had been planning this for years. He launched his campaign with a mix of youthful energy and seasoned polish. His slogan, "Great City, Great Mayor," was vague but reassuring. He ran as the candidate of the middle, pro-business, pro-reform, pro-efficiency. And once again, homelessness was at the center. He argued that San Francisco had lost control of its streets and that his policies were restoring both dignity and order. The race went to a runoff between Newsom and Matt Gonzalez, a Green Party member and favorite of the city's progressive base. The contrast couldn't have been sharper. Gonzalez represented a vision of San Francisco rooted in protest, anti-corporate activism, and social revolution. Newsom stood for measured progress, institutional reform, and growth. The city held its breath. In January 2004, at just 36 years old, Gavin Newsom was sworn in as the 42nd mayor of San Francisco. He was the youngest person to hold the office in over a century. Dressed in a tailored suit, surrounded by his new wife Jennifer Siebel and the city's political elite, he delivered a speech that struck a careful balance. Visionary but grounded, hopeful but realistic. The city, he said, had work to do, and he was ready to lead. But what no one expected was that just a few weeks into his term, Gavin Newsom would make a move that would ignite a national firestorm. It began quietly. In early February 2004, Newsom instructed the San Francisco County Clerk's office to begin issuing marriage licenses to same-sex couples. At the time, California law defined marriage as between a man and a woman. Newsom believed that law was unconstitutional. He acted without fanfare, without press conferences. One morning, couples arrived at City Hall, were welcomed in, and left legally married. The city was transformed overnight. Lines of couples, some together for decades, wrapped around the block. There were tears, laughter, and the kind of joy that doesn't need explanation. Inside the ornate rotunda of San Francisco's City Hall, love was not only seen, it was recognized. And then came the backlash. Within days, the legal challenges poured in. Conservative groups condemned the move as lawless. The state's Attorney General, Bill Lockyer, asked the courts to intervene. Commentators on national television called Newsom a renegade, a rule breaker, a glory seeker. The President of the United States, George W. Bush, would soon call for a constitutional amendment banning same-sex marriage altogether. Gavin Newsom stood his ground. In press briefings, he invoked the Constitution, not party politics. He cited the Equal Protection Clause and framed the issue in moral terms. "It's not a debate," he said. "It's about civil rights." His critics accused him of staging a political stunt. He countered that it was a matter of conscience. Some even within his own party distanced themselves. The timing was risky. It was an election year. But Newsom didn't flinch. In the end, more than 4,000 same-sex couples were married in San Francisco before the courts ordered a halt. Eventually, the California Supreme Court would nullify the marriages. But the impact had already been felt. The images of those weddings, of elderly couples finally holding hands with the law behind them, seared themselves into the national consciousness. It was a turning point, not just for the gay rights movement, but for Gavin Newsom himself. In one act, he had redefined his public image. No longer just a businessman in a suit, no longer just the moderate with good hair and corporate donors, Newsom had shown that he was willing to break with convention, take real risks, and make history. For some, it cemented their admiration. For others, it confirmed their fears. But no one could say he wasn't bold. San Francisco was watching. So was the country. And Gavin Newsom was just getting started. Chapter 4. Liberal Icon or Ambitious Maverick. By 2007, Gavin Newsom had become a name that resonated far beyond the borders of San Francisco. He was no longer just the young mayor who made headlines for issuing same-sex marriage licenses. He had become a symbol, depending on who you asked, of progressive courage, political recklessness, or carefully managed ambition. But no matter the interpretation, one thing was clear. Gavin Newsom was winning. When he ran for re-election that year, some predicted backlash. The controversy over the marriages had faded, but new challenges had emerged. San Francisco was still grappling with homelessness, housing shortages, and the widening gap between the city's tech-fueled affluence and the working-class communities being priced out. Critics accused Newsom of prioritizing image over substance, of chasing national attention rather than focusing on local needs. Others accused him of being too moderate in a city that demanded bold progressivism. But despite the noise, or maybe because of it, Newsom cruised to re-election with over 70% of the vote. The city hadn't turned on him. It had doubled down. Still, the second term would not be as smooth as the first. While his approval ratings remained relatively strong, the media had started looking closer. There was fascination with the mayor's personal life, and not just his policies. Newsom had always been a figure who attracted cameras. Tall, well-spoken, strikingly photogenic, with a perfectly calibrated mix of Kennedy charm and West Coast swagger. He knew how to smile for the cameras, but also how to deliver a message with force. He didn't just speak. He performed. Yet the very charisma that fueled his rise also made him a target. Headlines began to blur the lines between politics and celebrity. National magazines profiled him as America's most handsome mayor. He made appearances on cable news that often felt more like talk shows than policy discussions. He gave speeches with a cadence that sometimes sounded more like a presidential campaign than a city government update. And as the spotlight widened, so did the scrutiny. In early 2007, just months before his re-election, Newsom found himself at the center of a personal scandal that nearly derailed his career. It came out that he had had an affair with the wife of one of his top aides. Alex Turk, his campaign manager and longtime friend. The revelation hit hard. Turk resigned. The media pounced. For the first time, Gavin Newsom looked vulnerable. He called a press conference, admitted the affair, and apologized publicly. He appeared shaken, even humbled. The city watched, unsure whether it was witnessing the fall of a rising star or just another chapter in the chaotic story of San Francisco politics. But Newsom didn't resign. He didn't step back. He kept going. That ability to survive, some would say thrive, in the face of controversy became a recurring theme. It wasn't that he was untouchable, but rather that he knew how to recover. He understood the rhythms of public life, admit quickly, apologize directly, and move forward. In a city that prized authenticity, even flawed authenticity, he managed to hold on to his base. The headlines eventually faded. The political machine kept turning. Behind the scenes, Newsom's personal life was also evolving. Years earlier, he had married Kimberly Guilfoyle, a fellow San Franciscan who was both glamorous and ambitious in her own right. She had been a prosecutor, then a rising star in media circles, eventually becoming a co-host on Court TV and later Fox News. Their marriage had once been the darling story of San Francisco's political scene. Two young, attractive, high-powered professionals building their futures side by side. But the marriage didn't last. In 2006, Newsom and Guilfoyle divorced. Officially, it was due to the demands of bi-coastal careers. Guilfoyle had moved to New York for her TV work, and Newsom was embedded in the West Coast political grind. Unofficially, the pressures of public life, long separations, and growing differences wore them down. The split was amicable, but high profile. Not long after, Newsom met Jennifer Siebel, a Stanford graduate, actress, and documentary filmmaker, with her own impressive pedigree. She came from a background of business, philanthropy, and public service. Their courtship was fast but steady. She seemed to ground him. Where Guilfoyle brought flash, Siebel brought calm. In 2008, they married in a ceremony that combined elegance with understated charm, California chic. Together, Newsom and Siebel became something of a power couple in their own right. She was not just a political spouse, she was an advocate, a creative force, and a partner with her own mission. Her work in media and storytelling would later influence many of Newsom's policy interests around children, mental health, and gender equity. They built a family together, eventually raising 4 children while navigating the messy balance between public service and private life. But even as his personal life stabilized, questions lingered. Who was Gavin Newsom, really? Was he a liberal icon, bold, visionary, and willing to act where others hesitated? Or was he a maverick operator, more focused on image than impact, driven by ambition above all else? To some, he was the future of the Democratic Party. Young, tech-savvy, economically literate, and socially progressive. To others, he was a carefully crafted persona, more interested in headlines than hard decisions, more style than substance. His critics on the left accused him of selling out to developers and the wealthy. His critics on the right accused him of turning San Francisco into a laboratory of failed liberal ideas. The truth, perhaps, lay somewhere in the middle. Gavin Newsom wasn't easy to categorize. He supported same-sex marriage before it was safe, but also balanced budgets with a businessman's eye. He embraced environmental causes and tech innovation, but rejected ideological purity tests. He spoke the language of hope, but governed with spreadsheets and metrics. As his second term as mayor progressed, national Democrats began to pay closer attention. They saw a politician who could raise money, handle media, and win elections, even in a city as unpredictable as San Francisco. Rumors of higher office began to swirl. The Senate, the governorship, maybe even more. But for Gavin Newsom, the next step wasn't just about power, it was about timing. He understood that politics, like wine, required patience, process, and the right conditions to mature. And in California, change was always just over the horizon. Chapter 5. Lieutenant Governor in the Waiting Room. By 2010, Gavin Newsom was at a crossroads. He had served 2 terms as mayor of San Francisco, earned national recognition for his bold positions on marriage equality and homelessness, and was widely regarded as one of the rising stars of the Democratic Party. The question wasn't whether he would run for higher office. It was which one. For a time, the answer seemed clear. Governor. He launched a campaign to succeed Arnold Schwarzenegger and take the reins of the world's 5th largest economy. But the momentum didn't build as hoped. Jerry Brown, a towering figure in California politics and former 2-term governor, announced his own run. Brown's name recognition, deep ties to the Democratic establishment, and pragmatic appeal eclipsed Newsom's youthful promise. Rather than dig in for a messy primary fight, Newsom shifted gears. He recalibrated his ambition, withdrew from the governor's race, and pivoted toward the lieutenant governorship. It wasn't the job he'd dreamed of, and it wasn't a role loaded with power. But it was a foothold, a strategic pause, a place to wait, watch, and prepare. In November 2010, Gavin Newsom was elected Lieutenant Governor of California, winning by a solid margin in a statewide race that tested his appeal beyond the liberal bastion of San Francisco. It was a victory, but also a humbling moment. For someone used to headlines and executive action, the lieutenant governorship was, by design, a quiet post. The role held limited constitutional power, presiding over the state senate, sitting on a few boards, casting a tie-breaking vote if needed. Real influence came from relationships, not authority. Jerry Brown returned to the governor's office with a mandate to stabilize California's struggling economy. The Great Recession had left deep scars: budget deficits, crumbling infrastructure, and high unemployment. Brown, methodical and unflashy, brought decades of experience and an almost philosophical approach to governing. Newsom, now second in command, had to adapt. At first, the relationship was awkward. Newsom was energetic, media-savvy, and policy-hungry. Brown was disciplined, opaque, and not particularly interested in sharing the spotlight. The governor didn't need a co-star. He needed space. Newsom, for his part, had to find ways to make the job matter. So he looked for the cracks, the quiet policy areas where he could build his own portfolio, independent of the governor's agenda. He focused on three: the environment, higher education, and technology. California had long been a national leader on environmental issues, and Newsom saw climate change as both an existential threat and an economic opportunity. As chair of the State Lands Commission, he began pushing for a stronger transition toward renewable energy and offshore wind development. He championed sustainability in state infrastructure and raised alarms about the dangers of sea level rise along California's fragile coastline. His approach wasn't radical, but it was persistent. He published reports, convened panels, and used the office's limited pulpit to keep the climate conversation moving forward. In higher education, Newsom became a vocal advocate for reform. He saw California's world-renowned public university system, particularly the UC and CSU systems, as both a point of pride and a system under pressure. Rising tuition costs, overcrowded classrooms, and funding battles had threatened access and affordability. Newsom called for greater investment, but also innovation. He pushed for online education, credential modernization, and stronger community college pipelines. It was a wonky subject, not often headline-grabbing, but he understood its long-term significance. If California was going to remain competitive, he argued, it had to educate, not just the elite, but everyone. Then came tech. Silicon Valley was booming, and Newsom, with his business background and ties to venture capital circles, saw the potential and the risks. He positioned himself as a liaison between government and the tech world, advocating for smart regulation that encouraged innovation without surrendering public oversight. He talked about automation, workforce disruption, digital literacy, and the need for ethical frameworks in emerging industries. He warned about widening income inequality, even as he embraced the transformative power of technology. It was a balancing act. Pro-growth, but not blindly optimistic. Through all this, Gavin Newsom stayed visible. He gave speeches. He toured universities. He appeared on television and built a strong online presence. He published policy papers and opinion pieces, some of which drew more attention than the office he held. He knew the lieutenant governorship wouldn't define his legacy, but it could shape his credibility. So he used the time to sharpen his message, build networks, and quietly campaign for the future. In 2014, he ran for re-election and won again, this time with even broader support. The critics who once dismissed him as an opportunist began to see a different pattern. He wasn't rushing. He was evolving. The same mayor who had once made headlines for issuing marriage licenses in defiance of state law was now deep in the weeds of education policy and energy regulation. There were still occasional stumbles. Newsom's restlessness sometimes surfaced in the form of frustration with the limited power of his role. At one point, he openly criticized Brown's decision-making on gun control and criminal justice reform. The tension between the two men was never dramatic, but it was visible. Newsom respected Brown's discipline, but didn't always share his incrementalism. Brown, for his part, seemed wary of Newsom's flair for the camera. Still, Newsom stayed the course. He didn't bolt for a private sector job or angle for a national appointment. He stayed in Sacramento, studied the state's machinery, and waited. By the end of his second term, he had transformed the office from a ceremonial footnote into a meaningful platform. Not because he changed the rules, but because he redefined the role. He proved that even in a limited post, it was possible to lead, to push, to propose, to provoke. The governor's mansion still lay ahead. But now, Gavin Newsom was no longer just the former mayor of San Francisco with a famous name and a sharp suit. He was a statewide figure with policy credentials, relationships, and something more powerful than ambition, preparation. California was watching, and so was he. Chapter 6. The Road to Governor. By the time Gavin Newsom announced his candidacy for governor in 2015, few were surprised. He had been building toward this moment for nearly 2 decades. Through business ventures, mayoral battles, and 2 terms as lieutenant governor. His entry into the race wasn't dramatic or rushed. It was calculated. He launched early, long before others had officially declared, sending a clear signal. The campaign had begun, and he intended to define it on his own terms. From the start, Newsom's campaign mixed progressive vision with pragmatic messaging. He framed himself as both the heir to California's liberal tradition and the candidate best equipped to manage the massive, complex machinery of the state. He spoke of a California for all, a phrase that became both a slogan and a statement of values. It was a message designed to resonate across regions, from the tech corridors of Silicon Valley to the struggling towns of the Central Valley, from the wealthy enclaves of Los Angeles to the working-class neighborhoods of the Inland Empire. Newsom's platform leaned into big themes. The housing crisis, which had grown increasingly dire, became one of his central issues. Rents were soaring, homelessness was rising, and working families were being pushed further and further from job centers. Newsom didn't offer a single magic solution, because there wasn't one. Instead, he proposed a broad package, building 3.5 million new homes by 2025, streamlining local zoning approvals, enforcing housing quotas at the local level, and expanding affordable housing tax credits. He spoke about housing not just as an economic issue, but as a moral one. If the Golden State couldn't provide shelter for its workers and families, he argued, it wasn't living up to its promise. Alongside housing, education became a cornerstone of the campaign. Newsom championed universal preschool for all 4-year-olds, arguing that early childhood education was one of the most effective tools for long-term equality. He also proposed 2 free years of community college, expanded after-school programs, and better integration between K-12 schools and workforce development programs. It wasn't just about learning. It was about opportunity and about preparing California's next generation for an economy increasingly shaped by automation and technology. Another defining theme was immigration. California had become the nation's leading voice in the resistance to federal immigration crackdowns, and Newsom made clear he intended to defend that role. He pledged to uphold California's status as a sanctuary state, support legal assistance for undocumented immigrants, and expand protections for immigrant families. In campaign speeches, he called California a refuge of justice and promised to use every tool available to push back against what he called xenophobic policies from Washington. Behind the scenes, the campaign was a machine. It was well-funded, thanks in part to Newsom's deep connections in the business and tech worlds. Major donors lined up early. Labor unions supported him. Environmental groups endorsed him. And most of the Democratic establishment saw him as the inevitable nominee. His early entry into the race helped keep more serious challengers at bay. When the June 2018 primary arrived, Newsom finished comfortably ahead, setting up a general election against Republican businessman John Cox. The contrast between the two candidates could not have been sharper. Newsom was polished, fluent in policy, and emblematic of California's progressive identity. Cox ran as a Trump-aligned outsider, pledging to cut taxes, repeal environmental regulations, and clean up Sacramento. In many states, such a race might have been competitive, but not in California. As the campaign progressed, Newsom continued to widen the gap. He focused on climate change, expanding healthcare access, and strengthening gun control laws. He toured fire-ravaged communities in Northern California, listened to farmers facing water shortages, and met with students protesting gun violence. At every stop, he presented himself not just as a politician, but as a problem solver. Someone who had seen California from the inside and was ready to lead it from the top. He also didn't shy away from national issues. He spoke out against the Trump administration on everything from immigration to environmental rollbacks. But he did so with careful framing, less outrage, more resolve. He wanted to position California not just in opposition to the federal government, but as a beacon for what government could look like in a post-Trump era. He called the state a nation-state, with the resources, the population, and the influence to lead on its own terms. The media followed the campaign closely, but with little doubt about the outcome. Polls showed Newsom consistently ahead by double digits. Cox tried to frame Newsom as an elitist, out of touch with everyday Californians. Newsom countered with stories from his own life: his working-class mother, his struggle with dyslexia, his time as a small business owner. He didn't claim to be perfect, but he did claim to understand the stakes. On November 6, 2018, Gavin Newsom was elected the 40th governor of California in a landslide, winning nearly 62% of the vote. It was one of the largest margins in modern California history. The victory wasn't just electoral, it was symbolic. Newsom had transitioned from a big city mayor and lieutenant governor to the leader of a state with nearly 40 million people, the fifth largest economy in the world, and a culture that often set the tone for the rest of the country. In his victory speech, delivered in front of a cheering crowd in Los Angeles, Newsom didn't just celebrate. He projected. He spoke of hope, of responsibility, and of the long road ahead. "Now is the time for courage," he said. "Now is the time for leadership that puts purpose ahead of politics and people ahead of profits." He took the oath of office on the steps of the state capitol in Sacramento on January 7, 2019. In the crowd were his wife, Jennifer Siebel Newsom, their children, his father, then battling declining health, and political allies from across the state. The sun shone through patches of clouds as Newsom placed his hand on the Bible and promised to serve all Californians, rich and poor, urban and rural, documented and undocumented. It was a moment of arrival. The boy raised by a single mother in San Francisco, who once struggled to read aloud in class, had become the governor of the most populous and diverse state in the nation. But if the road to the governor's office had been long and carefully planned, the road ahead would be far more unpredictable. Because soon, a series of crises would test him in ways that no campaign ever could. Chapter 7. Governing California. When Gavin Newsom stepped into the governor's office in January 2019, the mood in Sacramento was cautiously optimistic. Democrats held a supermajority in the legislature, the economy was strong, and California's image as a national counterweight to Washington politics gave Newsom both a spotlight and a mandate. But California is never simple. From the moment he took office, Newsom faced challenges that would test not just his policies, but his patience, instincts, and ability to lead a state often too big and too fractured to move in one direction at once. Almost immediately, the wildfires returned. Massive, fast-moving blazes tore through towns and forests, turning skies orange and entire communities to ash. Paradise, just months earlier, had been obliterated by the deadliest wildfire in California history. Now, new fires were igniting across the state with terrifying frequency. It wasn't just the destruction. It was the fear, the uncertainty, and the question that loomed over every smoldering hillside. Why can't the state stop this? In the middle of the crisis stood PG&E, Pacific Gas and Electric, California's largest utility and, increasingly, its most controversial. PG&E equipment had been blamed for sparking several major fires. The utility, deep in debt and facing massive lawsuits, began preemptively cutting power to millions of residents to reduce fire risk. The blackouts swept across Northern California, shutting down schools, hospitals, and businesses. People were left in the dark, literally and politically. Newsom, still fresh into his term, was suddenly at the center of a crisis that spanned legal, environmental, and humanitarian dimensions. He criticized PG&E harshly, accusing the company of decades of mismanagement and greed. But he also faced scrutiny for accepting campaign contributions from the utility in past years. He quickly pledged to return them, but the incident revealed the thin line he would have to walk. Progressive expectations on one side, and the entrenched systems of California's economy on the other. Housing affordability was another wildfire. Slower burning, but just as destructive. In Los Angeles, San Francisco, San Diego, and even once affordable suburbs, rents were skyrocketing. Home ownership had become a distant dream for much of the middle class. Homelessness was rising. Tent encampments spread along highways and underpasses, visible evidence of a system stretched to its limit. Newsom, who had campaigned on building 3.5 million homes by 2025, now faced the reality of local zoning laws, neighborhood resistance, and economic constraints. He signed bills to streamline development, penalize cities that refused to meet housing quotas, and promote dense housing near transit corridors. But change was slow. Every proposed development met resistance, and every headline about growing homelessness chipped away at the image of progress. Still, Newsom didn't retreat from his promises. In fact, he expanded them. He pushed forward with an ambitious, progressive agenda, one that aimed to reshape key pillars of California life. On healthcare, he took steps to expand coverage to undocumented immigrants up to age 26, making California the first state to do so. He supported efforts to lower prescription drug costs, explored the creation of a state-run generic drug label, and spoke openly about long-term plans for a single-payer system, even if the political will wasn't yet there to make it happen. On gun control, he signed a package of new laws that strengthened background checks, limited firearm purchases to one per month, and expanded red flag laws that allowed the temporary removal of guns from individuals deemed a threat. As mass shootings continued to plague the country, Newsom made California's contrast with federal inaction part of his public message. He framed the state as a moral leader on gun safety, declaring that California didn't have to accept violence as inevitable. And then there was climate change, a crisis that underpinned every other. Newsom committed California to a carbon-neutral economy by 2045, banned the sale of new gasoline-powered cars by 2035, and directed agencies to accelerate clean energy investment. He also acknowledged the growing toll of climate-driven disasters, not just on the environment, but on the economy and public health. He spoke of adaptation, resilience, and equity. But with wildfires growing fiercer and droughts returning, the urgency was no longer theoretical. Yet even as he embraced the progressive mantle, Newsom's business roots were never far behind. He often spoke the language of innovation, praised public-private partnerships, and maintained strong relationships with Silicon Valley leaders. He didn't shy away from conversations with the state's wealthiest and most powerful CEOs. His belief in market solutions, especially around housing and energy, made some on the left uneasy. Critics within his own party accused him of being too cautious, too focused on appearances, too unwilling to take on entrenched interests. Housing advocates pushed for rent caps and tenant protections stronger than those he supported. Climate activists wanted faster action. Labor unions demanded more investment in workers rather than corporate incentives. Newsom was walking a tightrope, balancing bold vision with political calculus, trying to hold together a coalition as diverse as the state itself. He also faced criticism for his tendency toward lofty announcements without immediate follow-through. His habit of setting ambitious goals, millions of homes, universal preschool, carbon neutrality, sometimes outpaced the mechanisms to achieve them. For every successful bill signed, there were implementation hurdles, bureaucratic slowdowns, or legal challenges. The gap between vision and reality became a recurring theme in political coverage. Still, Newsom remained a dominant figure in California politics. He was visible, engaged, and active. He used social media to communicate directly with the public. He gave frequent press briefings and maintained a high level of public engagement. He traveled across the state, highlighting both successes and challenges, often standing in front of fire-scarred landscapes or housing projects in progress. By the end of his first year, Gavin Newsom had encountered more crises than some governors face in a term. The wildfires and blackouts had tested his emergency leadership. The housing crisis had tested his policy depth. The high expectations of the progressive base had tested his political agility. And yet, he remained where he had always been, at the center of California's political conversation, part idealist, part operator, navigating a state that demanded both. He had made it to the governor's office by building coalitions, reading the mood of the electorate, and projecting confidence in the face of uncertainty. Now, he was learning that governing wasn't about speeches or slogans. It was about trade-offs, timing, and the patience to keep moving forward, even when the fires kept coming. Chapter 8. Pandemic and Power. In early 2020, as the world watched an unfamiliar virus sweep through China and into Europe, California prepared quietly but anxiously. Governor Gavin Newsom, just over a year into his first term, monitored the reports closely. He had dealt with wildfires, blackouts, and housing debates. But this felt different. The threat was invisible, unpredictable, and spreading faster than any policy could contain. By March, COVID-19 had arrived in the United States, and California, with its dense cities and global connections, was in the virus's direct path. On March 19, 2020, Gavin Newsom made history. He issued the first statewide stay-at-home order in the United States, locking down California's nearly 40 million residents in a bold move that stunned the nation. Businesses shuttered, schools closed, freeways emptied. It was a decision few leaders had yet made, and it instantly put California and Newsom at the forefront of America's pandemic response. Other states watched closely. Some followed, others resisted. But in that moment, Newsom looked decisive, proactive, and unafraid to act early. The rationale was clear. Flatten the curve, buy time for hospitals, save lives. The state began securing masks, ventilators, and personal protective equipment. Emergency orders were issued. Press briefings became daily events, broadcast live and watched by millions. For weeks, Newsom projected calm authority. He explained data models, praised frontline workers, and reassured Californians that science, not politics, would guide the response. Poll numbers soared. Headlines called him a model of responsible leadership. Some began speculating about national ambitions. But crisis leadership is never linear. And the longer the crisis dragged on, the harder it became to balance public health with public patience. Mask mandates came next, then limits on gatherings, then shutdowns of indoor dining, gyms, schools, places of worship. The virus didn't slow, and neither did the public's exhaustion. California's size, once its strength, became a logistical nightmare. Local officials wanted flexibility. Residents wanted answers. Businesses wanted to survive. And while Newsom maintained his message, the pressure mounted from all sides. The state's unemployment system buckled under demand. Millions filed for benefits. Thousands waited weeks or months to receive aid. Confusion over school closures and distance learning grew. Parents struggled. Teachers' unions clashed with school districts. Misinformation spread. Rural counties resisted restrictions. Protests flared outside the capital. The longer the lockdowns lasted, the more California's unity began to fracture. And then came the French Laundry. On November 6, 2020, Gavin Newsom attended a birthday dinner for a lobbyist friend at the exclusive French Laundry restaurant in Napa Valley. It was an opulent, private affair, indoors, expensive, and precisely the kind of gathering state officials were telling everyone else to avoid. The dinner became public knowledge days later, first in whispers, then in photographs. The backlash was immediate and brutal. Critics called him a hypocrite. Supporters were stunned. The man who had urged millions to skip Thanksgiving with family had attended a maskless dinner with powerful friends. Newsom apologized quickly, admitting that it was a mistake and a lapse in judgment. But the damage was done. Trust, especially during a public health crisis, is fragile. And in that moment, many Californians felt betrayed. The scandal wasn't fatal to his career, but it marked a turning point. It gave his opponents a rallying cry and fractured some of the goodwill he had built during the early months of the pandemic. It also helped ignite the effort that would soon grow into a full-fledged recall campaign. A loose coalition of conservatives, libertarians, business owners, and frustrated residents began gathering signatures. Their message was simple. Newsom had overreached, underperformed, and acted as if the rules didn't apply to him. Meanwhile, the virus raged on. Hospitals in Southern California approached capacity. ICU beds filled. Mobile morgues were deployed. Vaccines, when they finally arrived, were a logistical triumph and a distribution headache. Newsom oversaw the rollout of a vast vaccination program that included stadiums, pharmacies, mobile clinics, and partnerships with the National Guard. By spring 2021, millions of Californians had been vaccinated. Case numbers began to drop. There was hope. But the recall effort didn't go away. In fact, it gained momentum. Enough signatures were collected to trigger an election. A date was set. A field of challengers emerged. The most prominent among them was conservative radio host Larry Elder, whose campaign drew national attention and deepened the political divide. Newsom's leadership was now under a different kind of spotlight. Not just policy scrutiny, but political survival. He defended his pandemic response as necessary, guided by science, and ultimately effective. He reminded voters that California had fared better than many states in terms of per capita death rates, that its economy was rebounding, and that the state had issued billions in stimulus checks and rental assistance. But he also had to reckon with frustration. People were tired of mandates, of masks, of isolation, of fear. He framed the recall as a power grab by extremists. And in a state where Democrats outnumber Republicans nearly 2-1, the strategy worked. High-profile surrogates, including President Joe Biden and Vice President Kamala Harris, joined the campaign to defend him. Millions of dollars poured into the effort. Turnout was high. On September 14, 2021, Gavin Newsom survived the recall in a landslide. 62% of voters chose to keep him in office. It was, in many ways, a reaffirmation, not just of his governorship, but of California's identity in a time of national uncertainty. Newsom emerged wounded but standing, a survivor of one of the most unusual political battles in state history. The pandemic hadn't ended. New variants would emerge. New challenges would come. But something had shifted. Newsom had faced fire from both sides, lost public support, regained it, and navigated a once-in-a-generation crisis while under constant pressure. Some called his leadership heavy-handed. Others called it necessary. But few could deny its impact. California had acted early, saved lives, and led the nation in vaccination. And Gavin Newsom, for all his missteps, had held the line. He had gone from rising star to embattled governor to comeback story, all in under 2 years. And while the road ahead remained uncertain, one thing was clear. He was no longer just governing California. He was defining it. Chapter 9. The Recall Battle. It began quietly, almost like a routine protest in the background of California's noisy political life. A recall petition against Governor Gavin Newsom was filed in February 2020, before the first COVID-19 lockdowns, before mask mandates and shuttered schools, before vaccines, variants, and daily briefings. At the time, the effort looked like the kind of long-shot challenge that popped up against every governor. California had seen over 50 such recall attempts in the past. Few of them had ever come close to success. But this time would be different. Because as the months went on, the world changed. And in the vacuum of crisis, frustration grew. By the summer of 2020, the recall campaign had found its fuel. The pandemic's second wave was straining hospitals. Businesses were closing. Children were learning from home, if they could. And millions of Californians were growing tired of shifting rules and restrictions. The French Laundry dinner in November poured gasoline on the fire. Images of Governor Newsom dining maskless at one of the most expensive restaurants in the country, while urging Californians to avoid gatherings, became a symbol of hypocrisy for critics and a rallying cry for those already on edge. The recall effort, led by a group of conservatives and libertarians, surged. Their argument wasn't just about COVID. It was about control. They accused Newsom of abusing emergency powers, of locking down the state too hard for too long, and of governing by decree. But the movement also tapped into deeper frustrations about homelessness, taxes, crime, housing prices, and what many saw as a growing divide between California's political elite and everyone else. The message was simple. Newsom had lost touch. Signature gathering intensified. Volunteers set up booths outside supermarkets and churches. Social media campaigns spread. In a rare move, a judge granted organizers an extension on the signature deadline due to pandemic-related disruptions. That extra time proved critical. By March 2021, the campaign had submitted over 2.1 million signatures. More than enough to qualify for a statewide recall election. At first, Newsom and his team tried to downplay the threat. But as the recall became official, the governor shifted into campaign mode. The stakes were enormous, not just for his political future, but for the broader identity of California. The state hadn't recalled a governor since 2003. When Gray Davis was ousted and replaced by Arnold Schwarzenegger. That election had turned into a political spectacle. This time, Newsom intended to keep the message focused. But he had competition. The field of candidates lining up to replace him was large and eclectic. There were reality TV personalities, business owners, former athletes, and fringe figures. But one name quickly rose above the rest. Larry Elder. A conservative talk radio host with a long career in media, Elder entered the race in July and immediately changed the dynamic. With sharp rhetoric, a loyal following, and a clear ideological contrast to Newsom, Elder became the de facto face of the recall movement. He railed against mask mandates, vaccine requirements, and what he described as liberal overreach. He criticized public schools, promised to roll back environmental regulations, and pledged to dismantle what he saw as California's bloated bureaucracy. For many conservatives, he represented a chance to fundamentally shift the state's direction. For Newsom, Elder became the perfect foil. The strategy from the governor's camp was clear. Nationalize the race. Frame it as a battle not just about policy, but about values. Newsom and his allies argued that the recall was being driven by Trump-aligned extremists, people who opposed abortion rights, denied climate change, and undermined public health. They painted a picture of what California could become under Republican leadership and used Elder's own words on women, race, guns, and vaccines as warnings. High-profile Democrats rallied to Newsom's side. President Joe Biden, Vice President Kamala Harris, Senators Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders all lent their voices to the campaign. Millions of dollars poured in. TV ads blanketed the airwaves. The message was simple. Stop the Republican recall. And then there was the question of how to vote. The recall ballot was structured in two parts. First, should Gavin Newsom be removed from office? Second, If he is recalled, who should replace him? Newsom's team urged voters to leave the second question blank. Focus only on no for the first. Don't legitimize the process, they said. Don't split the vote. Just vote no. As Election Day approached, polls tightened. Early summer numbers showed the recall within striking distance. But Democrats pushed hard to mobilize voters. Mail-in ballots went to every registered voter in the state. Turnout became the deciding factor. Newsom's fate would depend on whether his base, largely urban, young, and diverse, showed up. And they did. On September 14th, 2021, California voted. The result was decisive. Nearly 62% of voters rejected the recall, and Newsom remained in office. The margin wasn't just a win, it was a landslide, and it wasn't evenly distributed. Coastal cities like Los Angeles, San Francisco, and San Diego broke overwhelmingly for Newsom. Rural counties leaned toward the recall. The divide was stark, geographic, and political. In his victory speech, Newsom didn't gloat. He thanked voters for rejecting cynicism and division, and reaffirmed his commitment to leading with compassion and science. But the message was clear. The recall had failed not just because of strategy or money, but because the majority of Californians still believed in his leadership, even with all its flaws. The recall battle left scars. It exposed the deep ideological rifts within the state and highlighted the challenges of governing during a prolonged crisis. It also drained resources, tested alliances, and put Newsom under a level of scrutiny few governors ever experience. But it also strengthened his position. He had faced a direct challenge to his legitimacy and emerged stronger. Some speculated the recall had elevated Newsom to the national stage. Others saw it as a warning that even in deep blue California, public patience had limits. But for Gavin Newsom, it was a test of endurance, strategy, and survival. He had faced the fire, and he was still standing. Chapter 10. A national profile emerges. After surviving the 2021 recall in a decisive landslide, Gavin Newsom stepped out of the California political bubble and into the national spotlight with renewed momentum. He had gone toe-to-toe with a Trump-aligned movement and won. He didn't just hold his seat, he reasserted his command over the political narrative in the nation's largest state. But what followed wasn't just a victory lap in Sacramento. It was something broader, bolder, and unmistakably strategic. Gavin Newsom was no longer just the governor of California. He was becoming a national figure. Almost overnight, the tone around him changed. In right-wing media circles, he became a lightning rod, a symbol of liberal overreach, the personification of California values that conservatives loved to mock. Fox News ran segments on him almost daily, painting him as the embodiment of what they believed was wrong with progressive governance. High taxes, homelessness, environmental regulations, and what they called authoritarian COVID policies. His face became shorthand for West Coast liberalism. And for Newsom, that was just fine. He didn't shrink from the attention, he leaned in. Newsom began showing up where few Democratic governors ventured, deep red states. In 2022, while other Democrats kept their heads down during the midterms, Newsom went on the offensive. He aired television ads in Florida, hammering Governor Ron DeSantis on civil liberties and LGBTQ+ rights. He bought billboard space in Texas, criticizing abortion bans and warning residents about encroachments on freedom. The message wasn't subtle. Freedom is under attack, the ad said. Come to California, where we still believe in it. It was a calculated move. By taking on the highest-profile Republican governors in their own territory, Newsom positioned himself as a fighter, not just for California, but for a national set of democratic values. While others in his party stuck to safe ground, he embraced confrontation. He didn't just criticize red state policies. He framed California as the ideological opposite. Where DeSantis signed laws banning books, Newsom expanded library funding. Where Texas banned most abortions, Newsom signed laws turning California into a reproductive rights sanctuary. Where others sought to restrict voting, he moved to automatically register more. In this political chess match, Newsom wasn't pretending to be neutral. He was drawing lines. The national media noticed. Profiles in the New York Times, The Atlantic, and Politico described him as aggressive, unapologetic, and clearly testing the waters. He didn't say he was running for anything, but he didn't have to. His travel schedule, messaging, and media presence all suggested a broader play. He debated DeSantis surrogates on cable news, gave interviews about national strategy, and even launched a political action committee, Campaign for Democracy, to fund efforts against Republican policies across the country. And still, the denials came. Whenever asked about presidential ambitions, Newsom responded with a smile and a firm no. He said he supported President Biden. He said he wasn't running in 2024. He said his focus was California. But the speculation never stopped. Reporters, pundits, and political operatives saw what he was doing. The trips, the ads, the messaging, the optics. It all looked like a shadow campaign, not against Biden, perhaps, but preparing for whatever came next. Inside California, the response was mixed. His base admired the boldness. Progressives liked that he was pushing back against right-wing narratives on a national stage. But critics asked whether he was neglecting state issues. The housing crisis hadn't vanished. Homelessness was still rampant. Some wondered whether the governor was too focused on other states while his own still struggled with the basics. Still, his national image grew stronger. When President Biden faced criticism for his age and approval ratings, cable news panels inevitably brought up Newsom as a future contender. His name began appearing in early polling for 2028, sometimes even as a hypothetical primary challenger in 2024, despite his repeated insistence that he had no such plans. When asked about these rumors, Newsom stayed carefully on message. He praised Biden. He defended Vice President Kamala Harris. But he never closed the door completely. Behind the scenes, his political network expanded. His team grew more professional, more national in tone. He met with donors, consultants, and party insiders across state lines. He started showing up at national Democratic events, not just as a guest, but as a keynote. His speeches were fiery, data-driven, and full of contrast. Where others offered nuance, Newsom offered clarity. He told voters that democracy itself was on the line, that the fight wasn't just about policies. It was about values, identity, and survival. And then there was the style. Newsom didn't look like the average politician. His suits were sharp, his hair carefully styled. He moved like someone used to being on camera. His voice, measured, confident, never rushed, gave him a presidential air, even when he wasn't talking about the presidency. To some, it was theatrical. To others, it was effective. In an era where perception shaped reality, Newsom understood how to command the frame. His relationship with the Biden administration remained publicly cordial, but there were whispers of quiet friction. Newsom rarely criticized the president directly, but he sometimes moved faster or further than the White House on progressive issues. He seemed to be building a parallel brand, aligned but distinct, loyal but ready. In interviews, he began talking more about national themes: freedom, equality, climate, education. He still discussed California, but increasingly as a model for what the rest of the country could be. He framed California as a preview of the future, a place where renewable energy, inclusive policies, and innovation could thrive. His critics argued that he was overselling the state's successes, but his supporters saw something else: vision. By 2023, Newsom's national profile was undeniable. He wasn't just a blue state governor. He was a political force. Whether it was by design or instinct, he had turned crisis and criticism into a springboard. He had survived a recall, faced down the loudest voices in conservative media, and emerged with a bigger audience than ever before. And yet, the biggest question remained unanswered. Was he preparing to lead California into a second term, or preparing for something more? The rumors persisted, the headlines speculated, the denials continued. But Gavin Newsom kept moving, and the country kept watching. Chapter 11: Family, Faith, and Public Persona. Beneath the headlines, the legislation, and the high-stakes battles of California politics, Gavin Newsom has always understood something essential about public life. Politics is not just policy, it's perception. But perception is shaped by more than campaign ads and press conferences. It is forged in family, in faith, in the small details that make a political figure more than a title. And for Gavin Newsom, the man behind the governorship has long been defined not just by what he believes, but by who stands beside him. He met Jennifer Siebel in 2006, not long after the end of his high-profile marriage to Kimberly Guilfoyle. Jennifer was accomplished in her own right, a Stanford graduate, athlete, businesswoman, and documentarian with a strong voice and an independent vision. Her early work focused on media, gender, and the ways women were portrayed in film and politics. Their connection was immediate. In her, Newsom found not just a partner, but a mirror. Someone who shared his drive, but brought a different perspective. Someone rooted in purpose and not easily swayed by appearances. They married in 2008, in a Montana ceremony that was both intimate and elegant, blending tradition with modernity. In the years that followed, they became parents to 4 children. 2 daughters, 2 sons, building a life together that existed parallel to the one Newsom lived on the public stage. Fatherhood changed him. The pace of politics didn't slow, but his sense of responsibility deepened. He spoke often about his children, not as props or anecdotes, but as a moral compass. He viewed his decisions through the lens of their future, the world they would inherit. Climate policy wasn't just science, it was stewardship. Education wasn't just reform, it was legacy. At home, Jennifer Siebel Newsom emerged as a figure with her own public mission. As first partner of California, a title she chose deliberately to reflect gender neutrality, she led initiatives on gender equity, mental health, and youth empowerment. Her documentary work, including Misrepresentation and the Mask You Live In, tackled tough questions about identity and media. She challenged outdated models of masculinity and advocated for emotional well-being among boys and young men. While Gavin governed, Jennifer inspired. And together, they became not just a political couple, but a symbol of modern leadership, fiercely aligned, deeply human, and committed to something beyond careerism. But the balance was never easy. Political life is invasive by nature. Reporters dig, cameras follow, schedules don't sleep. For the Newsoms, keeping family life sacred required constant effort. They shielded their children from the spotlight as much as possible, limiting media appearances and choosing their public moments carefully. When the pandemic forced daily press briefings into every living room, Gavin often spoke from a somber podium. Behind the scenes, he returned home to 4 young kids adapting to Zoom school, missed birthdays, and masked playgrounds. The contrast was stark. Executive orders by day, bedtime stories by night. Through it all, his Catholic upbringing remained a quiet thread in his life. Raised in the traditions of the church, Newsom attended parochial school and absorbed the rituals and teachings that shaped his moral compass. But as he grew older, and especially as he stepped into public office, his views began to evolve. On issues like same-sex marriage, abortion rights, and gender identity, Newsom departed sharply from the official positions of the church. Yet, he never rejected his faith outright. Instead, he reinterpreted it. He spoke of Catholicism not as dogma, but as a foundation for compassion. He cited the gospel's emphasis on caring for the poor, the sick, the outcast. He framed his policies on homelessness and healthcare not in political terms, but as moral imperatives. "My faith teaches me about justice," he said in one interview, "about mercy, about love. That's the version I follow." It wasn't always well received by religious conservatives, but it resonated with many Californians who, like him, had grown up inside tradition and grown into a more nuanced view of the world. On the issue of abortion, Newsom became one of the most vocal defenders of reproductive rights in the country. When Roe v. Wade was overturned in 2022, he positioned California as a sanctuary for abortion access, signing legislation to protect patients and providers, expanding funding, and launching public information campaigns across state lines. For him, the question wasn't just legal. It was personal. It spoke to autonomy, to justice, and to what kind of society his daughters would grow up in. Critics accused him of using religion when it was convenient. He responded by saying that moral conviction isn't limited to any one faith or any one party. Still, the contradictions remained. The man who dined at French Laundry during lockdowns was also the father who read bedtime stories while issuing public health orders. The governor who demanded bold climate action also negotiated with oil and gas interests. The public persona, confident, polished, media-savvy, sometimes clashed with the private realities of exhaustion, regret, or self-doubt. But Gavin Newsom, perhaps more than most, understood the weight of the stage he stood on. He didn't claim perfection. What he offered, instead, was continuity. A belief that government could still work, that leadership still mattered, and that public service, despite its flaws, was still worth the cost. Jennifer's presence helped reinforce that. As a partner, she challenged him to stay grounded. As a mother, she reminded him of the stakes. And as a public figure, she carved her own path, not in his shadow, but beside him. Together, they redefined what it meant to be a political couple in the 21st century. Not glossy, not performative, but committed to each other, to their children, and to a vision of California that mirrored the best of their values. In the end, Gavin Newsom's family wasn't just a part of his biography. It was the frame through which he made sense of his role. His children shaped his urgency, his wife shaped his voice, and his faith, reinterpreted and challenged, shaped his sense of purpose. The cameras caught the podium speeches. The voters remembered the policies. But it was in the quiet, unrecorded moments, in whispered prayers, scraped knees, and late-night talks, that the man behind the office stayed human. And in politics, sometimes, that's the hardest image to protect. Chapter 12. Policy Legacy and Controversies. As Gavin Newsom moved deeper into his tenure as governor, the spotlight shifted from the drama of elections and pandemic crisis management to a more enduring question. What would he leave behind? In the swirl of headlines and speeches, a governor's legacy is not written by intention alone, but by impact. For Newsom, that legacy has been defined by a mix of bold ambitions, deep contradictions, and a state that both embraces and challenges his leadership at every turn. From the beginning, Newsom set out to frame California as a model of progressive governance, bold, compassionate, and future-focused. One of the clearest expressions of this was his commitment to universal preschool. Expanding access to early childhood education wasn't just a policy goal. It was a reflection of his long-held belief that equity begins at the very start of life. He championed funding for transitional kindergarten for all 4-year-olds. And he pushed to expand access to child care subsidies for low- and middle-income families. For Newsom, the argument was economic and moral. Invest early, and the dividends are seen in higher graduation rates, better health outcomes, and reduced inequality. In tandem with his education agenda, he advanced one of the most aggressive minimum wage policies in the country. Building on legislation passed before his term, Newsom oversaw increases that brought California's minimum wage to one of the highest in the nation, $15 per hour for most workers, with plans for automatic adjustments based on inflation. He defended the move as necessary in a state where the cost of living was soaring, and he framed it as part of a broader effort to ensure dignity and stability for working families. Critics warned it could hurt small businesses, but Newsom insisted that a strong economy should not rely on poverty-level wages. Perhaps no area more clearly defined his policy vision than California's clean energy transition. Newsom placed climate change at the center of his administration's long-term planning. He signed executive orders to phase out gas-powered vehicles by 2035, accelerated investment in wind and solar infrastructure, and committed the state to carbon neutrality by 2045. Under his leadership, California moved aggressively to close oil wells near homes and schools, tighten emission standards, and fund green job training programs. He spoke of climate policy not only in terms of environmental protection, but as an economic engine, creating jobs, attracting investment, and positioning California as a global leader in the post-carbon era. But even as these policies attracted praise from progressives, international observers, and environmental advocates, Newsom faced mounting criticism at home. The most visible and persistent issue was homelessness. Despite billions in funding, new programs, and expanded shelters, the tents remained. In Los Angeles, San Francisco, Sacramento, and San Diego, encampments lined sidewalks and freeway underpasses. Voters grew increasingly frustrated, unsure whether anything was actually improving. Newsom argued that homelessness was the product of decades of neglect, skyrocketing housing costs, and untreated mental illness. And he wasn't wrong. But the optics were hard to ignore. For many residents, the presence of homelessness in public spaces felt like a direct failure of government. And as the man at the top, Newsom bore the brunt of that perception. Closely tied to the homelessness crisis was the issue of affordability. California remained, under Newsom's leadership, one of the most expensive places to live in America. Median home prices soared past $800,000 statewide. Rent took up more than half of income for many families. Newsom backed legislation to increase housing density, eliminate single-family zoning in certain areas, and hold cities accountable for meeting construction targets. But zoning laws, local opposition, and bureaucratic inertia slowed progress. The number of new units built each year still fell far short of what experts said was needed to stabilize prices. And while Newsom's administration invested heavily in housing programs, the perception remained that the state was falling further behind. Adding fuel to the criticism was Newsom's close proximity to the state's tech and business elite. Long before he was governor, he had received financial backing from figures like Gordon Getty and maintained relationships with Silicon Valley's biggest names. While those ties helped fund his campaigns and amplify his messaging, they also created an image, fair or not, of a leader more comfortable in Napa wine caves and Davos panels than in working-class neighborhoods struggling with rent and groceries. His critics accused him of governing for the wealthy, of being too slow to regulate the tech industry, and of failing to hold powerful corporate landlords accountable. And yet, the numbers told a more complicated story. Under Newsom's leadership, California saw consistent job growth following the pandemic recession. The state added hundreds of thousands of new jobs, particularly in green energy, construction, and healthcare. Its economy rebounded faster than many others. The GDP grew. The unemployment rate dropped. Even amid criticism, California maintained its position as the world's fifth largest economy, larger than India, the UK, or France. But economic growth didn't mean economic equality. The wealth gap in California remained stark. The top 1% saw record gains, while many middle and lower-income households struggled to keep up with inflation, housing costs, and rising utility bills. The state's prosperity wasn't evenly distributed, and critics argued that Newsom hadn't done enough to close the divide. Tax credits, stimulus checks, and targeted relief programs helped many families during the pandemic, but the structural inequalities remained deeply entrenched. Through it all, Newsom's approval ratings rose and fell with the tides of crisis and recovery. His defenders pointed to measurable progress, expanded Medicaid access, clean energy milestones, higher teacher pay, and strengthened gun safety laws. His detractors pointed to the tent cities, the traffic, the cost of groceries, and the perception that the California dream was slipping away. But even his critics often admitted one thing: Newsom never stopped trying. He wasn't a passive administrator. He proposed, adjusted, retooled, and tried again. He embraced big goals, even when they seemed politically risky. And he communicated those goals with the polish and fluency of someone who believed that government could still be a force for good. As his second term began, the question of legacy became more pressing. Would Newsom be remembered as the governor who helped transition California into a cleaner, fairer, and more innovative future? Or would his tenure be defined by homelessness, high costs, and unmet expectations? The answer, like his record, was mixed. He had changed California in real ways, but not always fast enough or deep enough for those most in need. His policies reflected a clear vision, but the outcomes remained uneven. He governed a state both thriving and struggling, bold and burdened, admired and criticized. And somewhere in between those contradictions, Gavin Newsom's legacy was still being written. Chapter 13: The 2024 Election Cycle and Beyond. After the recall battle, The national stage that Gavin Newsom sought finally seemed to expand before him. The 2024 election cycle, chaotic, polarized, full of unexpected turns, offered a chance to test whether Newsom was being seen merely as a governor of a huge state or as a consequential figure in American politics. In this chapter, we trace how his role evolved, as surrogate, as debater, as defender of the party, how his clash with Ron DeSantis in 2023 shaped perceptions, and how whispers of a presidential run persist louder than ever against a backdrop of caution and calculated moves. When the 2024 cycle got rolling, Joe Biden was renominated as the Democratic standard-bearer. But there were concerns within the party over his polling, age, and ability to lead a high-energy campaign. Newsom did not enter that race, but for many Democrats, he increasingly became a go-to surrogate, someone who could articulate sharp critiques of Republicans, defend Democratic policies, and help mobilize voters. He appeared in national media interviews, criticized conservative policies in red states, and frequently contrasted California's direction under his leadership with what he cast as backward moves elsewhere on climate, immigration, abortion access, and civil liberties. He was loud without being the nominee, visible without being in the primary race. His speeches emphasized democracy, equity, and federalism, ideas that played well with progressive voters, but also with moderates uneasy with extremism. Part of Newsom's growing national profile came from how he handled debates beyond just the political forums inside California. A key moment had come in 2023 when he debated Florida Governor Ron DeSantis in a much-publicized event hosted by Fox News. This red versus blue state debate was billed as a contest of ideas. Florida's, under DeSantis, focused on limits to governmental power, parental rights, school choice, and conservative social values. Newsom's on climate, public health, pro-choice rights, immigration, and protecting civil liberties. The debate was rough. It featured accusations of misrepresentation, shouted interruptions, and sharp contrast in styles. DeSantis more confrontational, Newsom more fact-laden, but also combative when pressed. Viewers saw Newsom defending California's COVID response, criticizing what he saw as authoritarian tendencies among the GOP in red states, challenging DeSantis on book bans and abortion restrictions. There were fact-checkers later who said both sides stretched the truth in places. Some analysts saw the debate as more style over substance. Newsom, already a polished speaker, used the stage to highlight his contrasts with conservative governors. DeSantis used it to shore up his conservative base. For Newsom, the debate seemed to serve several goals simultaneously: to burnish his national credibility, to energize liberal voters, and to remind media and party leaders that he could carry a broader message. Whether that counts as strategic brilliance or political theater depends on the viewer. But the outcome was clear. Newsom's stock rose. He didn't win a primary or presidency yet, but after that debate, more people began to view him as part of the emerging Democratic future. In the aftermath of 2024, speculation about Newsom's presidential prospects grew louder. For years, he had consistently denied interest in running. But in mid-2025, those denials softened into something more ambiguous. In June 2025, Newsom publicly acknowledged that it's a possibility, even while emphasizing that serving Californians still came first. The shift was subtle but tangible. It suggested that Newsom is now keeping future options open rather than firmly shutting them down. Poll numbers reflect that change. In August 2025, An Emerson College poll showed Newsom leading the pack among Democratic primary candidates for 2028. While the election is still years away, gaining traction so early is politically significant. It affects how donors, media, and activists treat him. A lead in early polling doesn't guarantee a nomination, certainly not a presidency, and there remain many obstacles. But for someone with his resume, it signals momentum. With greater visibility comes greater strategy. Newsom has engaged in several moves that seem calibrated for national influence. For example, he's pushed for Proposition 50 in California, a special election to change how congressional redistricting works in the state in response to red states' efforts. That proposal, if approved by voters, would temporarily restore power to the state legislature to draw congressional districts rather than an independent commission, in effect enabling maps more favorable to Democrats. Newsom has positioned this as a defense against gerrymandering elsewhere, particularly Texas, and as part of a broader strategy to protect Democratic representation. Such issues, redistricting, voting access, are national in scale, cutting across states, parties, and courtrooms. But even as speculation grows, Newsom remains formally silent about launching a campaign. He continues to emphasize California priorities: housing, climate, energy affordability, public health, showcasing policy wins in his home state while traveling to key states like South Carolina, speaking to national audiences, and using media appearances to sharpen his message. He's discussed battles over immigration enforcement, climate regulation, and education in ways that suggest he's already playing on a broader field. There are risks. Nationalizing his profile exposes him to sharper attacks. Some critics within his own party worry that moderating or controversial positions, for example, his recent statements on transgender athletes, collaborating across the aisle on certain issues, engaging with conservative media in his podcast, may alienate progressive voters or open him up to charges of inconsistency. Also, focusing on national issues sometimes brings greater scrutiny to California's persistent problems: housing affordability, homelessness, cost of living, which can undermine momentum. And governors running for higher office often suffer from lapses or crises at home that become eigenvectors for opposition attacks. Newsom is no exception. His own state's challenges provide ammunition to those who would argue he is flawed, not visionary. As of late 2025, Newsom's term as governor is set to end in 2026. That timing shapes much of the calculation. If he were to run for president or another national office, the decision window is narrow, and every action from now until then carries increased significance. Donor relationships, national endorsements, media presence, all are being watched. Many believe that 2028 is the year to watch, and the seeds he plants now, style, alliances, message, will matter deeply. So where does that leave us? Gavin Newsom in 2025 is no longer simply a governor of a blue state. He is a figure straddling two arenas, deeply committed to California's governance, while also testing the waters for something larger. His debate with DeSantis, once a spectacle, now looks like an early salvo in a longer game. His rising poll numbers suggest the base is curious, perhaps growing eager. Yet his careful discretion, repeated disclaimers, and attention to state issues show he does not want to be consumed by runaway speculation. Not yet. Episodes like the Proposition 50 effort, the energy affordability legislation, his redistricting proposals, and selective media engagements make it clear. Newsom is constructing a national profile with both ambition and caution. When 2028 arrives, if he runs, many pieces will already be in place. Recognition, controversy, supporter base, but also expectations, scrutiny, and the weight of his record. Whether he will run and whether he can translate popularity into winning coalitions remains undetermined. But in 2025, Newsom seems to have moved from being a rising star to being considered by many as a front-runner. In politics, timing is everything. For Gavin Newsom, the next year, or the next two, may decide whether he is remembered merely as one of California's most energetic governors, or as someone who stepped onto the national stage and claimed something bigger. Chapter 14. Gavin Newsom in American History. When the dust eventually settles and Gavin Newsom's political career is carved into the larger narrative of American public life, historians may find themselves asking the same question that followed him for decades. Was he a Kennedy-style symbol of generational idealism and image-driven leadership? Or was he something more grounded, a pragmatic insider who rose through skill, longevity, and timing? The answer, much like California itself, resists a simple label. Because Newsom is not a static figure. He reflects and refracts the contradictions of the state he governs, its ambition, its excess, its vision, and its vulnerability. Placed alongside other California governors, Newsom stands in a crowded historical lineage, each of them a mirror of their moment. Jerry Brown, who preceded him, governed with stoic restraint and philosophical distance, often seeming more interested in legacy than popularity. Brown's career was marked by fiscal caution and institutional knowledge, a master of the long game. Newsom, by contrast, is kinetic, faster in speech, quicker in media, and far more comfortable navigating modern political warfare. Compared to Ronald Reagan, another towering Californian who ascended to the presidency, Newsom represents a polar opposite in ideology. Where Reagan sold optimism through conservative values, small government, personal freedom, traditional family, Newsom has tied his own version of optimism to the capacity of government to do more, not less. Universal preschool, expanded healthcare access, environmental regulation, and guaranteed reproductive rights are not just policies. In Newsom's framing, they are moral imperatives. He governs from a fundamentally different assumption, that the state isn't the problem, it's the tool for solving problems. And then there's Arnold Schwarzenegger. Like Newsom, he was a creature of image, charisma, and California's unique relationship with celebrity. But Schwarzenegger governed as a centrist outsider who promised to fix a broken system. Newsom, though equally camera-savvy, is the opposite of an outsider. He rose through the system, mastered its internal workings, and turned connections into platforms. Schwarzenegger charmed his way into politics. Newsom calculated his way through it. Still, each of these men captured something about the state during their time. Brown represented the institutional memory of California politics, a tether to both caution and depth. Reagan reflected the conservative shift of post-1960s America, rising from the West with a message of traditionalism cloaked in sunshine. Schwarzenegger was the postmodern populist, a brand before branding became the norm. Newsom's version is perhaps the most 21st century of them all. A politician born from a mix of Silicon Valley swagger, progressive ambition, and social media era reflexes. He governs with one foot in the spreadsheet and one in the story. He knows how things work, but he also knows how they look. That tension between substance and symbolism has followed Newsom since his earliest days in public life. Critics call him too polished, too rehearsed, too concerned with aesthetics. Supporters argue that clarity of message matters, and that modern leadership requires fluency in narrative as well as policy. When he issued same-sex marriage licenses in 2004, was it reckless theater or righteous leadership? When he debated Ron DeSantis in a high-profile, nationally televised showdown, was it posturing or preparation? When he spoke of California as a nation-state, was it vanity or prophecy? Because, in many ways, Newsom's career is as much about California as it is about himself. To study his trajectory is to study the state's own contradictions. A tech-fueled economic juggernaut with staggering inequality. A leader on climate while grappling with wildfires and water shortages. A haven for immigrants and innovation. But also home to housing crises and urban despair. Newsom never shied away from these contradictions. He tried to harness them, sometimes successfully, sometimes not. But he always treated California as more than a state. To him, it was a model. And that's where his place in American history may ultimately rest, not just in what he did, but in what he symbolized. Newsom embodied the idea that blue state governance could be both ambitious and managerial. He didn't just sign progressive laws, he tried to measure them, track their outcomes, and defend them in public. He brought in technocrats, built data dashboards, launched task forces. He talked in numbers and in narrative. For those looking for a modern version of liberal governance, one that wasn't nostalgic or defensive, Newsom offered a version that felt assertive, unapologetic, and designed for a new generation. But there were limits. California's crises didn't disappear under his leadership. Homelessness worsened. Housing remained stubbornly unaffordable. Wildfires returned each year like clockwork. He made bold promises, and sometimes the execution lagged behind. His critics on the left said he moved too slowly. His critics on the right said he moved too far. The center he occupied was constantly shifting, and he had to shift with it. And yet, there's something enduring about how he managed to hold it all together. Newsom governed during one of the most volatile periods in modern history. A global pandemic, a national reckoning on race, an attempted recall, a deeply divided electorate, a media environment spinning faster than most institutions could follow. And through it all, he didn't fade. He didn't disappear into scandal or collapse under pressure. He made mistakes, some serious, but he adapted, recalibrated, and stayed visible. Historians will likely note that he helped redefine what it meant to be a governor in the post-Trump, post-COVID era. That he saw state leadership not as a local role, but as part of the national conversation. That he exported policy ideas across state lines. That he inserted himself into red state versus blue state showdowns, not just as a partisan, but as a challenger to the very framing of those divisions. That he believed in the role of government to shape a fairer, cleaner, more inclusive society, even if the results fell short of the ambition. They'll also note that his story remains unfinished. As of 2025, the presidential rumors swirl. His polling numbers climb. His political action committees grow. He says little, but travels often. And that strategic silence may be one of his strongest moves yet. If he runs for president, his California legacy will become the foundation of his pitch to the country. If he does not, he may still shape the party from behind the curtain, influencing policy, mentoring the next wave, and reminding Democrats that boldness and discipline aren't opposites. They are tools. In the end, Gavin Newsom's place in American history won't be decided by a single policy or election. It will be decided by whether his vision of governance, proactive, values-driven, technologically fluent, and nationally engaged, becomes the new model for what leadership looks like in a fractured, fast-moving, deeply divided America. He may be remembered as the governor who tried to turn California into the future. Or he may be remembered as the politician who showed the rest of the country what the future might demand. Chapter 15. Epilogue. As Gavin Newsom enters the final stretch of his second term, California once again finds itself at a crossroads, turbulent, transformative, and staring straight into the future. So too does its governor. The man who once ran a wine shop in San Francisco is now one of the most recognized Democratic figures in the country, standing at the uneasy intersection of achievement and ambition. And while his name echoes in conversations about presidential politics, the truth is simpler and more complex at once. Gavin Newsom's story is not finished. It is still being written, one decision, one speech, one contradiction at a time. California, as always, remains both a proving ground and a pressure cooker. The state leads on innovation, climate, and culture, but it also wrestles daily with housing shortages, infrastructure strain, and deep socioeconomic divides. The governor's second term was never going to be a victory lap. It began not with fanfare, but with challenges. Rising insurance premiums due to wildfires and flooding, lawsuits over homelessness and public camping, and mounting tension between housing mandates and local control. Even as Newsom spoke on national stages, California's municipalities filed lawsuits against his administration. Progress, he would argue, was being made. But the friction was louder than the milestones. The pressure wasn't only external. The second term of any leader brings with it a different kind of clock. The power is still there, but the end is always ticking louder. There are no re-election rallies to plan, no third term to court. Every policy push, every veto, every word from the podium is filtered through a narrower lens. Legacy. What will remain when it's over? Newsom knows this. You can see it in how he speaks now, more precise, more reflective, still passionate, but more aware of the long view. His tone has shifted subtly from campaign optimism to a kind of executive realism. The work is slower now, more complicated. Federal gridlock, legal opposition, and internal democratic divides create roadblocks that no press conference can dissolve. His climate goals face economic headwinds. His housing plans hit bureaucratic walls. Even his education reforms, bold in promise, must pass through layers of local governance and political inertia. And yet, the ambition never dims. It hums underneath every initiative, every bill, every national media appearance. It is not ambition in the narrow sense of personal gain, though that question still lingers, but ambition in the larger sense. To leave California better than he found it. To use its vast resources, diversity, and influence, not just to manage problems, but to reshape what governance can look like in the modern era. Still, that tension between ambition and legacy follows him. For every voter who sees in him a future president, there's another who asks why homelessness has worsened. For every national pundit praising his ability to command a room, there's a small business owner wondering why permits take months and costs never fall. For every promise fulfilled, there's another waiting in the wings, unfinished, delayed, or caught in the complex machinery of the state. And beyond Sacramento, the world has noticed. Newsom's travel in recent years has not been limited to California towns and cities. He's walked the streets of red states, hosted events in swing districts, clashed with conservative governors, and launched national initiatives through PACS and media platforms. All the while, he maintains the familiar refrain, He's not running. He's focused on the work. He supports the president. And yet, with each carefully worded response, the speculation only grows stronger. If Gavin Newsom runs for higher office, his record in California will be scrutinized more closely than ever. Every policy will become a litmus test. Every contradiction will be weaponized. His closeness to Silicon Valley will be framed as either visionary or elitist. His environmental leadership will be measured against blackouts and wildfire seasons. His housing goals will be judged not by press releases, but by street-level realities. The contrast between the narrative and the lived experience will come under a national microscope. But if he doesn't run, at least not yet, what then? What does a post-gubernatorial life look like for someone who has never taken his foot off the accelerator? Does he step into a federal role? Does he return to the private sector? Does he write books, build institutions, mentor the next wave, or quietly shape the Democratic Party from behind the curtain? Even that question seems premature, because for now, Gavin Newsom is still very much in motion. He wakes each day to the inboxes of a state that never sleeps, a political environment that never forgets, and a nation that now sees him as more than just California's governor. He stands not just at the edge of his term, but on the edge of possibility. And so his biography remains open-ended. It is full of milestones. The same-sex marriage order in 2004, the pandemic lockdowns, the recall survival, the DeSantis debate, the clean energy mandates. But it is also full of contradictions. Luxury dinners during crises, slow movement on entrenched issues, moments where the ideal outpaced the implementation. He is at once an emblem of California's progressive promise and a symbol of its deepest challenges. He is both aspirational and controversial, both polished and bruised. For some, that contradiction is a flaw. For others, it's what makes him real. In the arc of American political history, there are few figures who have managed to stay relevant without staying static. Newsom has evolved, sometimes by force, sometimes by foresight. He has absorbed pressure, criticism, even scandal, and remained standing. His strength is not invincibility, but adaptability. And in a political era where volatility is the norm, that may be the most valuable skill of all. As California continues to grapple with the complexities of the 21st century, so too will Newsom. Whether as governor, national figure, or future contender, his role is still unfolding. His speeches are still being written. His policies are still being tested. His decisions are still shaping lives, some praised, some resented, but none ignored. This is not a closing chapter. It is a pause between acts, because the story of Gavin Newsom, for all its weight and symbolism, remains unfinished. The podium is still warm, the cameras still follow, the voters still ask questions, and the man at the center of it all still shows up, confident, calculated, imperfect, and entirely aware that history doesn't wait, it watches.